Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 46th week of 2014. For more than 20 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media. First on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good folks at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussant tonight is Ron Szoke. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for more than twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that in the American media, quote, either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true and will sound like it's from Neptune. Our format is to take turns suggesting stories from the week's news that have been ignored or misreported, sometimes even innocently, and then having our colleagues comment on them. Previous programs are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find articles and comments from viewers, not all unadulterated praise, and some answers from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. It's November 14th. On this day in 1851, Herman Melville's Moby Dick was published in New York. And 4 years later, he published a less successful, but maybe at least as important, novella called Benito Cereno. On our Facebook page, there is an article by the historian H. Bruce Franklin from the interesting Los Angeles Review of Books. Franklin is writing about Greg Grandin, the historian, Empire of Necessity, which takes off from Melville's story, Benito Cereno. Franklin writes, imagine Herman Melville reading Greg Grandin's The Empire of Necessity, Slavery, Freedom, and Deception in the New World, that's the subtitle, published this year by Metropolitan Books. Castigated and eventually ignored in his own lifetime, Melville would have to be amazed and thrilled that in the second decade of the 21st century, one of America's most distinguished historians would be using his 1855 novella, Benito Cereno, as the main vehicle to explore the history of slavery and the waves of revolution sweeping through the Western Hemisphere in the early 19th century. Grandin even takes the title of his book from Melville's epigraph to The Bell Tower, published 2 months before Benito Cereno, and foreshadowing the novella's bleak prophecy for the U.S. slave republic. In Grandin's appalling vision of the human and natural devastation perpetrated by Europeans and Americans, Melville could find validation of his own denunciations of imperialism and his declaration that the white civilized man is the most ferocious animal on earth. With a gratifying vindication, especially since that declaration and all the other anti-imperialist and anti-racist passages in Tipei, Melville's first book, were censored out of every American edition published during his lifetime. He would find, perhaps to his surprise, that this 21st century historian not only shares but also can openly state much of what he, Melville, was trying to express through his writing career, despite the increasingly vicious attacks that forced him to conceal many of his later and most profound messages under layers of trickery and masquerade, quote, directly calculated to deceive, egregiously deceive, the superficial skimmer of pages, close quote, as Melville once put it. Grandin, the modern historian, ascribes to Melville precisely the philosophic position and character that Melville unmasks and skewers in his remarkable novel, The Confidence Man. And in this, Franklin, who is reviewing this work that we're speaking of, points out that even the excellent historian Greg Grandin probably undercuts Melville's own subversive views. And to make the point, Franklin quotes a piece from this later novel, The Confidence Man, when a gruff, rifle-toting, eccentric Missourian confronts an avatar of the Confidence Man with a direct challenge. "You are an abolitionist, aren't you?" The Confidence Man, this peculiar character that Melville creates to cover over, perhaps, his real views, the Confidence Man responds, "As to that, I cannot so readily answer. If by abolitionist you mean a zealot, I am none. But if you mean a man who, being a man, feels for all men, slaves included, and by any lawful act opposed to nobody's interest, and therefore rousing nobody's enmity, would willingly abolish suffering, supposing it, in its degree, to exist, from among mankind, irrespective of color, then I am what you say." Close quote. A wonderful sketch of the liberal position, perhaps. Missourian's reply exposes the true character of all those Democrats and Republicans are complicit with slavery and empire then and now. Quote, "Picked and prudent sentiments. You are the moderate man, the invaluable understrapper of the wicked man. You, the moderate man, may be used for wrong, but are useless for right." Close quote. Herman Melville's views of slavery and empire were actually closer to Grandin's than Grandin seems to think they were. "Perhaps," writes Bruce Franklin, "I imagine Melville being thrilled and amazed by the empire of necessity, slavery, freedom, and deception in the New World," Grandin's book, "simply because I'm thrilled and amazed by this inventive, audacious, passionate volume, which has taught me so much about slavery, freedom, and deception in the New World. Even if it doesn't plumb the depths of Melville's deceptions, it certainly shows us new ways to grasp the relevance of Benito Cereno for our past and present, and unfortunately, maybe our future." Close quote. Bruce Franklin. And he says early on in this review, which, as I say, is on our Facebook page and is very much worth reading, early on that you really should stop reading what he's writing about these two authors and go read Melville's Benito Cereno. And that's probably good advice. You're watching News from Neptune, a moderate man edition. As Melville writes, "The moderate man is the invaluable understrapper of the wicked man. You, the moderate man, may be used for wrong, but are useless for right." Close quote. How's your feeling about moderation these days, Ron?
Well, I have a kind of negative view about moderation and centrism and so on. People who try to come down between the two extremes somewhere.
Yeah, right.
They do this kind of geometrically without regard to the actual issues involved. They mark out the most extreme rightward view that they can think of, that they know about, and the most extreme leftward view, and then bisect that segment and think that they have acquired and are showing great wisdom in doing this by coming down squarely between the two. So this has been tried again and again by so-called or self-called radical moderates,
Right.
and the third way, and on. And well, I view it as kind of contemptible and not wise at all, but it keeps coming up by people who cannot really engage with the actual issues involved and come down clearly on one side or the other.
Like the character in Silas Marner who says again and again, "The truth lies somewhere between you."
Yes, right. Right. So sometimes that's true also, but and we must be moderate in our moderation. But
That's not bad.
yeah, but again, another old cliche, and yeah, when it comes to political judgment and so on, I have a certain admiration for conservatives who know what they're talking about and understand the great historical tradition of conservatism, but even more for the leftists who have, and radicals who have equally or even greater comprehension of the historical tradition of radicalism, rebellion, and revolt against existing conditions. So what the conservatives seems to be about, I don't think they often understand this or think it through, is conserving the existing structure of wealth and power, and anyone who doesn't object to that, I think, is missing the point of politics, or maybe of life itself.
I think, in fact, that if we simply abandon the terms conservative
Yes,
and progressive,
yes,
you know, and then pick up the conversation, we might be much better
Yes.
off.
So, yeah, I would certainly favor a finer-grained analysis. These are very big counters
Exactly.
to play with: liberal, conservative, and so on. And let's talk about the particular issues and cases. The problem with that, of
Exactly.
course, is you can confound people also by becoming too fine-grained and focused on particular individuals,
Of course.
and so on. And then things become absolutely chaotic and bewildering, and there's no way to build a kind of intellectual structure on that stuff. There's always something coming along which will confound whatever it is you're saying. That's just part of the inherent complexity of the world, I think.
I want you to get to your list, but this conversation leads me to a passage I ran across this weekend from G.K. Chesterton, writing in the 1920s. Chesterton writes, "The whole modern world has divided itself into conservatives and progressives." This is 1924 now. "The business of progressives is to go on making mistakes. The business of conservatives is to prevent mistakes from being corrected. Even when the revolutionist might himself repent of his revolution, the traditionalist is already defending it as part of his tradition.
Yeah.
Thus we have two great types: the advanced person who rushes us into ruin, and the retrospective person who admires the ruins. He admires them especially by moonlight, not to say moonshine. Each new blunder of the progressive or prig becomes instantly a legend of immemorial antiquity for the snob. This is called the balance, or mutual check, in our Constitution." So
Yeah.
here we are, the modern man.
Yeah, well, this opposition goes back even further. Like most things, it can probably be traced back to Heraclitus or Aristotle or something. But yeah,
dangerous
W.S.
radical
Gilbert,
Aristotle.
of Gilbert and Sullivan fame, wrote, "Everyone is born a little
There we
liberal or
are.
a little conservative." And people seem to divide up this way, not so much on an intellectual basis, some say, but a temperamental basis. And
Some people even saying it's genetic these
yes,
days.
yeah, right. And the psychologists who investigated this, the different psychology of the liberal and conservative, find that conservatives are much more attuned to the dangers around them, and they want to keep pointing out that what this will lead to, and the backfire that will come from this social measure, and you can't really improve anything by deliberate social action, and so on. It will always revert to its traditional pattern, and we should consult the wisdom of the elders and the dead about all of these things, and they think they know what that is, what the dead would say today about various measures, and I think they're wrong about that, but anyway.
I've become much more in favor of the wisdom of the elders the older I get. So,
Yeah, right. Yeah, I agree.
what's on your agenda for today?
Well, I thought by mentioning empire of a necessity, you were going to talk about this thing that keeps coming up, another cliche, about the USA being the necessary nation in the world. And what is necessity, and why is the USA supposed to be the necessary nation in the world? What does that mean to you? Anything? What are these people saying?
Well, what we're doing is we're covering sin with smooth names. We're looking for ways to give as it were, objective, back to the issues we've been talking about, account of how the American hegemony established in the Second World War, when the U.S. emerges as the only undamaged country, winners or losers from the Second World War, and is able, in fact, therefore, to organize the world as it wishes. And it's quite interesting to look at American discussions during the Second World War, while the war was still going on, when it was clear that that was going to be the outcome one way or another, and the U.S. was actually planning for what sort of grand area planning, they called it, what sort of organization, economic primarily, of the rest of the world, economic and political, should be undertaken for the benefit of the American upper class. I mean, they're quite common, they're quite candid about it. The famous remarks of George Kennan in the Policy Planning Memorandum number 23 of the State Department in the late 40s sets this out in so many words. And Kennan was a liberal who was talking about the liberal account, the progressive account, so to speak.
Yeah.
So, you know, the direction was clear, and American policy ever since is in some sense an attempt, as Kennan says in that memo, to maintain the disparity.
Well, yeah, what it means to me is that the USA has taken over, wittingly or unwittingly, the role that the United Nations was supposed to have in guaranteeing the security of a lot of countries around the world, and giving to itself, in a unipolar world since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the right to supervise all military, economic, and political developments everywhere in the world, and they need our approval for those things. And if they don't get it, we have the right to invade them and change regimes and overcome their instability, which is really a laugh in itself. When we start bombing, shooting, burning, and killing people in the name of their lack of stability or lack of democracy or whatever it's going to be. So you get the usual fog of statements about freedom, democracy, and human rights, and how we're going to bestow these things upon them and build nations and so on. And what this has led to again and again is the morass, the quagmire in Southeast Asia, and now increasingly in the Middle East, where Obama is blundering again, as he said he wouldn't do after looking at what happened to LBJ, into another quagmire, keep getting drawn in again and again, because we can't win militarily, and in an attempt to do so, or to stave off ultimate defeat and expulsion, we have to keep sending in more armaments and eventually more troops. And that question is being reopened again and again now. Most of the criticism coming from conservative commentators now is that Obama did not go into Iraq, Syria completely and fast enough, and we have to keep fighting and killing some more. And others are pointing out that this only creates a worse and worse situation. Every bomb we drop there is turning more and more people against us, and increasing the probability that there will be terrorist acts here at home by people who have observed what's happening there, or their relatives, or ideological compatriots and so on. And it's not looking good. So a few people are making sense about this, I think. I was disappointed to see that Andrew Abasovich really seemed to take this line that we resolve to do these things and then don't put enough resources into them and so on. But Phyllis Bennis has been saying some very good things about this, about how we're creating enemies every day by this. Every bomb we drop, every ISIS member that we shoot and eliminate is just deepening the problem. And it's not looking good at all.
There are two models here, though, or two general ways of looking at this that I think you and I may represent opposite examples of. On on the one hand, there's the notion that the classic word is quagmire, the quagmire theory of Vietnam, that the U.S. blundered into Vietnam because it really didn't understand these strange Asian people.
Yeah.
The U.S. blundered into Vietnam and it resulted in 4 million dead people, but of course it was just stupid. This view, it's a popular view. The most liberal columnist in the American press at the time of the liberation of Saigon, Anthony Lewis said that, of course, the Vietnam War had begun with blundering attempts to do good. And that is the view, as I say, across the board amongst the liberal community, liberal foreign policy community, to this day. You'll find the same sorts of things going on, and the same model applied to the Middle East. Well, we were trying to do good. We were trying to build democracy in Iraq when we invaded them. We're trying to build democracy in Afghanistan. This, I think, is frankly nonsense, quite remarkable nonsense. And all the talk about freedom, democracy, and human rights that we hear from American leaders of both parties, by the way, in terms of what they are planning to do, that's for domestic consumption. There's one enemy, and one enemy alone, that the American planners fear, and that's the American public. And the great example here is what happened in Vietnam. By the end of the 60s, 70% of Americans opposed the war in Vietnam, and it took 5 years to liquidate it, so to speak, along with the liquidation of millions of Southeast Asians and a good number of Americans as well. But the problem here was never blunders. The problem was trying to keep the American people on that side. An amazing article, amazing editorial that I wanted, or interview that I wanted to talk about in another context today with Henry Kissinger by the magazine Der Spiegel, the German news magazine this week. And in this, Kissinger, who says some interesting things in various ways, probably the senior war criminal alive in America today, Kissinger says, of course, all 5 wars that the United States has conducted since the World War II have been strongly supported by the populace. Now, that's a flat-out lie, and one wonders, whether Kissinger even believes it, because he can read the polls too. The polls are clear, and what Americans' opinion on these wars, including Korea, by the way, actually were, is there for all to read. But the point is, you have to convince people that, oh yes, this is supported, this is the American populace is behind it.
Well, isn't there a difference between the initial stages of the war and the last stages? I mean, isn't there a lot of initial enthusiasm in many quarters for these wars, but after a few months and 2 or 3 years at most, people get tired of it and say, we don't like it anymore.
Yes and no. Yeah. I mean, you remember the largest anti-war demonstrations in history, as people talked about the largest anti-war demonstrations in history occurred in 2002 and 2003, not just in the United States, but around the world, against Bush's plan to invade Iraq.
Right.
I mean, so you say, well, okay, there was initial enthusiasm. Certainly that's true. But there was also a remarkable dissidence in the American populace about that war. And it does contrast quite sharply with the beginning of the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, the initial invasion of South Vietnam by the U.S. occurred in the Kennedy administration in 1962. Most Americans weren't even aware of it, and weren't aware of it for a long time. The war perhaps obtruded for the first time in the consciousness of many Americans with the Tonkin Gulf incidents of the summer of 1964. But I mean, that was 2 years in which the bombing of Vietnam was going on, the invasion of South Vietnam was going on, and most Americans didn't know about it. Even after the Tonkin Gulf incident and the extension of the war to North Vietnam, it took years before the anti-Vietnam War movement got underway.
Yeah.
And it was quite remarkable that the movement became a mass movement in the U.S. with a majority of Americans supporting it by the end of the 1960s.
Yeah. LBJ regretted and cursed about being saddled with that war. Apparently, he knew he couldn't withdraw because America never loses wars, and but he thought that there was nothing he could really do about it. That he was being sucked in further and further. And Obama is supposed to know about and have talked about this precedent, but seems to have no effect on his behavior.
Well, you're the one who cautions us all the time about ascribing motives and divining motives, at least, of these various actors. And usually in response, I want to say to you, let's look at what they've done, and what they're actually doing, and contrast this with what they say they're doing. Now, in the case of Johnson, the notion that he was trapped has been put forward for a long time, just as the notion that Obama is trapped in the Southwest Asian War. I don't think either one is true, not talking here of motives and what they might decide, but what they literally could do. When Obama became president, he did not have to send 30,000 more troops to Afghanistan. He had just been elected president, and he had the sort of freedom that, strangely, he seems to be enjoying today, now that he's no longer worried about maintaining a congressional majority. He didn't have to do that. Johnson, who was eminently available to the notion that there were things that he could do that might be different from what he says, certainly could have done something different. And if we want an example, look at Ronald Reagan or the Reagan presidency, whoever was calling the shots, we don't need to decide that, after the Beirut bombing that killed several hundred American soldiers, Marines rather. The withdrawal from Beirut was immediate. Now, this is Ronald Reagan, a supposed conservative, and presumably a standard American warrior, but he could do it, and they did do it. And I would suggest that it didn't represent a real change in American policy at all. It was, as they say, a tactical withdrawal. And tactical withdrawals, even on a fairly large scale of tens of thousands of troops, were available also to other American presidents.
Yeah, I would say that the circumstances were somewhat different, and that it wasn't viewed as a threat by communism to expand, but
I don't think the U.S. was ever worried about communism expanding, quite frankly.
Okay.
No, I really don't. I mean, you look at what happened at the end of the Second World War. American planners are not stupid. They can see what the historical case is, but they do know they have to sell the product. It's an advertising issue here, you know, and we have a tradition of thinking that advertisers aren't entirely candid about what the product is that they're selling. Well, I think that's probably the best way to look at what was going on in the United States. At the end of the war, at the end of the Second World War, the United States knew perfectly well that it was the Soviet Union that defeated the Axis powers, that defeated Germany, not the U.S. I mean, our mythology was the war was won on the beaches of Normandy and so forth, but Normandy was always a sideshow. The war was won and lost in Eastern Europe, and all the vast majority of German troops remained in Eastern Europe even after the invasion of Normandy to the very end of the war, when finally the Russians won the war against the Nazis. So you had the situation at the end of the war, an exhausted Russian army that had lost, and a Russia that had lost millions of people in the war. This aspect I'd always was interested in hearing about was the state of the Russian army in 1945. In the next year or two, the U.S. is going to say the Russians are about to seize Paris. I had got somebody tell me that in so many words, not too many years after that. And the Russian army at the time its mechanized divisions, half of its mechanized divisions were drawn by horses. Because, of course, you know. Okay, now this was the army that the U.S. was facing at the end of the war, and the U.S. was not afraid of the Soviet Union as an army. It was afraid of the Soviet Union as an idea. It was afraid of the idea of socialism and its attractions to Western Europe. And American politics in the generation, really, after the Second World War, what we call the Cold War, was really an attempt to make sure that Western Europe was incorporated into the American economic organization of the world and didn't go off into that strange way that those Easterners seem to have in mind, some sort of socialism. Yeah. Well, the limitations of the Russian variety of socialism meant that it finally was not that attractive a model. But in the meantime, the U.S. had done a great deal to make sure that the attractions of the model were not effective in Western Europe.
Yeah, there's, I think, a great fear in the ruling circles that there would be an alternative model for economic development and national power and so on.
That's what Vietnam was about too, by the way.
Yeah, there was vast exaggeration about the military strength of the Soviet Union and how the Russians were coming to get us. And it still goes on to some extent. There was a movie, The Russians Are Coming, The Russians Are Coming.
I was just thinking that myself, yes.
Yeah.
And once again, the poets often get there first, or the movie makers do. Yeah. That movie, which, by the way, still remains interesting, sends this notion up without really seeing it or saying it and so forth. It's a brilliant job.
Now, the latest absurdity is this mysterious phantom submarine that the Swedes have supposedly detected somewhere. They don't know what it is or where it is, but everyone was instantly saying that it must be a Russian submarine.
I think it's the Loch Ness Monster having decided that the vote didn't go its way in Britain, so should look for other climes, you know.
But back to the question of a couple of minutes ago, my default assumption is that people's intentions are generally confused. They don't know what their own motives are and so on. So I have to assume that their intentions and motives are pretty much the same as mine or any decent person's would be. And that's just a working hypothesis, though. And I'm not opposed to invoking this as an explanation of why people do what they do. I think ultimately you have to do that because their behavior becomes completely unintelligible if you have some insight, if you don't have some insight into what their motives and intentions are. The problem is that, again, most people really don't know. They're not clear about what their own motives and intentions are. And you can use several hypotheses to try to figure that out. But ultimately, well, following this line will carry you into behaviorism or behavioralism or one of those things. But again, that's why it's so hard for me to understand the behavior and the actions, really, of people in other cultures in ancient times and so on. How can we understand what Alexander the Great was up to or any of the well-known actors in history? We can do that only insofar as we can recreate in our own minds what his motives and intentions were. Some have said, like the historian, what's his name? Anyway, it'll come to me. And I think there's a certain element of truth in that. In order to understand what someone is doing, you have to try to think yourself into their position and try to understand what their motives and intentions were. So ultimately, I think you have to do that, and that's comes to me now. Robin Collingwood insisted on
Collingwood.
this.
Oh, sure. Okay.
Yeah, on this, and I think there's some truth in it. So I'm not saying that we can't talk at all about motives and intentions. I think ultimately we have to do so, but people, I think, are often far too quick to do so.
Well, let me offer you a counterexample and see what you do with it. After the 9/11 attacks, we had a interesting example of this problem in this country as those attacks were described for most Americans as irrational and completely incapable of being understood machinations by people with a foreign ideology or a crazy religious idea. And so we have our president telling us they hate us for our freedom and things like this. But the whole point was that we had to say that those attacks were done by people who don't think like us. They're evil and they have to be opposed, but any attempt to understand why they were done and what their motives were, that was seen as outrageous. And in fact, the one place it came up, I think, was in the presidential debates a few years later when Ron Paul, of all people, stepped forward and said, look, these people are attacking the U.S. because we've been attacking them. We have armies in their countries, we've overthrown their governments, we've invaded their countries, and these are counterattacks. And the outcry was tremendous, even that evening, I remember, in the discussion. The fact that anything should even be suggested that these attacks might be understood, not justified at all, but simply understood, that was just right out. You couldn't do that.
Well, it came up again in that piece I once quoted from Robert Kagan, the chief neocon ideologist, that we are the children of the Enlightenment, and we have to think that there's a certain rational basis for what people do, but they don't view things that way at all, and they're completely irrational from our point of view.
They're not like us.
Yeah. And they just don't think like us at all, and that's the great fallacy behind Obama not sending in overwhelming firepower into ISIS and so on.
You can't reason with these people, you just got to kill them.
Right, right.
The old man in the British Museum had as his motto, according to his daughter, Karl Marx, had as his motto a line from the Roman poet Terence, Homo sum nec humanum alienum a me puto. I am human, and therefore I think that nothing human is foreign to me. That's a very interesting sort of thing to say, and not the sort of thing we normally take to be the notions of the presumed father of communism. But it's that sort of identification, that willingness to say, yeah, they might be thinking the way we are too, let's try to understand what's being said here, even if we think that it's issued in crimes, because then perhaps we may understand some of our own crimes as well. That sort of talk has not been part of much American propaganda in the last decade or so, or even before.
Yeah. This comes up again. To switch to a slightly different topic, if you're ready, about interpreting the November 4th election. And,
talking about irrational behavior now, are we?
Right. Well, I read this morning in Mother Jones Online a piece by Kevin Drum, which seems to have a good deal of merit in it, it seems to me. And he invokes this notion of human nature, which we've been talking about directly or indirectly here the last few minutes, about why the white working class doesn't vote in its own self-interest so often. The question is, why did the white working class vote so heavily against the Democrats? Well, that's not largely true.
There's quite an assumption here, huh?
Yeah. He says it voted Republican by a 30-point margin last week. And this appears as a real dilemma. The set of issues in which the Democratic Party is most coherent these days is social progressivism, which I think means in the direction of social welfare and equality, but that's arguable. While these issues unite college-educated voters and working-class minority voters, they historically alienated the white working class. So what I wanted to get to here is this statement further on. Why does the white working class continue to loathe Democrats so badly? I think the answer is as old as the discussion itself. They hate welfare. And I've discovered this again and again. I'm from the white working class. I know a lot of those people. I've talked to them endlessly. And this is the big thing on their minds is we're working and paying taxes in order to support all of these parasites, the minorities, the blacks in particular, but the Latinos and the illegal immigrants and so on, and providing them with all sorts of benefits and goodies and subsidies and so on that we, the real Americans, are not getting.
And yeah,
yeah. But he says, when the economy stagnates and life gets harder, people get meaner. That's just human nature, looking for a scapegoat. Is that true? I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Well, I think it also, but we have to recognize how constructed that view is. I mean, that has been a major theme of American capitalist propaganda for more than a generation. The Reagan administration was a certain high point of that. Reagan on the welfare queens and so forth, you know, was an extremely active and conscious attempt to demonize the folks who are taking away what you have. The real folks who are taking away what things have, remember that wages in this country have been essentially flat or downturn since the 1970s. So by the time the Reagan administration came along, you had, 7, 8 years of this sort of decline. And if you talked about who was actually taking away people's wages, you would have to begin talking, as we do today, or at least as we do here, about the 1% and about neoliberalism and so forth. Neoliberalism was having its effect, and the wages were being suppressed. Things were being taken away from the white working class and others as well. Yeah. The point was to find out who the who the villains were, who was taking away that stuff. Yeah. Well, the answer turned out to be the black woman who was drawing welfare when she shouldn't be, And that was now we've seen this before, and I don't think it's wrong to look at this parallel. In the 1890s, August Bebel, a German social democrat, pointed out that anti-Semitism, which was rife in Europe at the turn of that century, anti-Semitism was the socialism of fools. What he meant by that is that people understood in the downturn of the economy at the end of the 19th century that something was being done to the economic well-being of Europeans. Somebody was doing it. And you had to find out the villain. You had to find out who was taking away the benefits that socialism, remember socialism had a great cachet in Europe at the end of the 19th century, the benefits that socialism was promising. Someone's keeping us from that. Who's keeping it from? Well, they had an answer in Europe at the end of the 19th century. The answer was the Jews, the money lenders. These are the people who were confiscating our wealth. Now we've got the blacks, the welfare queens and so forth, who are confiscating the benefits that the society should be bestowing upon us. The parallel is not exact. All historical analogies limp, but still in all, it's worrisome enough to direct us, I think, to what the real problem is here and what the white working class is actually thinking and doing and what it's being conditioned into thinking and doing by the regnant propaganda in the society.
Yeah, that's right. Kevin Drum goes on to say, so who does the white working class take out their anger on? The answer is the poor.
Yep.
In particular, the undeserving poor. Liberals may hate this distinction between the supposedly deserving and undeserving poor, but it doesn't matter if we hate it. Lots of ordinary people make this distinction as a matter of simple common sense. And this is supposed to be, for many people, kind of bedrock basic morality that it's in Paul's letters in the New Testament and so on, that those who don't work don't have a right to eat. And I've seen this sticker on pickup trucks around town and so on, that we work in order to pay taxes for that will support the people on welfare. And those people who are lazy and shiftless and don't want to work and are getting all kinds of government benefits and affirmative action and so on. It really burns their behinds to see what some would say, I mean, there have been a few cases of it, of affluent blacks getting preference in university admission, for example, over poor whites.
I think and once again, as with all great lies, there's a germ of truth in it,
Yes.
and an important germ of truth. I mean, affirmative action programs have been a program of protection of the inequality built into capitalism. The classic book by Walter Ben Michaels pointed this out, a decade ago. The trouble with diversity, and the notion that we were substituting diversity for equality, or that we were ignoring equality, ignoring the growing inequality, and saying that's okay, we'll let some talented members, as W.E.B. Du Bois said, the talented 10th, succeed, and therefore justifies a vastly unequal system, an increasingly unequal system. But a lot of people don't want to hear that, but it seems to me that that is the argument that should be going on. And it doesn't tell in the favor of affirmative action programs or programs for the undeserving, as you say.
Yeah. The other thing that really antagonizes these people is this talk among upper middle class whites, particularly of so-called white privilege. Mm-hmm. And these white working class people say, what is that? I mean, why can't we get some of that supposed white
Where's
privilege?
my privilege?
Yeah, yeah. And to them, that seems totally crazy and absurd. And they start talking about political correctness and condemning that and so on. But
we have, on this program particularly, made it a theme that the identity politics is in fact an enemy of the class politics that are required and an alternative to it. And in fact, it was the great refusal by American liberals in the 1970s to counter neoliberalism with a reassertion of class politics and an acquiescence that led them to say, okay, how about identity politics? Then we'll take care of our group, you take care of your group, and so forth, and we won't challenge this neoliberal reassertion of the rule of capital with the notion that moves towards equality of the sort that were involved, at least in some sense, in the New Deal and afterwards, are what we should be concerned about. That great failure of American liberalism over the last 40 years, the failure to answer the counterattack of neoliberalism on the 60s, on the New Deal, on the whole tradition of economic amelioration of the previous generation. That failure, I think, is coming home to roost, and that's really finally what we're dealing with.
there's a conviction, absolutely unshakable, it appears, among my white working class family and friends and so on, that illegal aliens are getting all kinds of benefits and free medical service, for example, while the real Americans like themselves don't get those things. And the Democrats are buying the votes of those people in that way. So the government handouts then are the result of the Democrats and liberals trying to buy the votes of these illegal immigrants and the minorities and so on. So this collides with their notion of a just world. Mm-hmm. And there's been some psychological writing about this, the common belief in what's called a just world. And people, this thesis says, get pretty much what they deserve. And people are poor just because they're lazy and they don't want to work and they're undeserving and so on. They don't like to use this to justify their own case and why they're poor, but they're kind of trained into that some would say, by the media and the educational system. It spoils their identity enough that they began to think that they're not really deserving of the wealth and privileges of the upper middle class and so on. So, and yet at the same time, they resent all of this. And there's more and more talk among political scientists about what they call the resentment vote, directed at, well, what used to be called the elitists. We haven't been hearing so much about that since Romney and his views on the 47%
Right.
of the takers in the population. But yeah, how do people try to explain their own social standing and status in the larger world? And there you get into some really messy kind of stuff. So are you getting everything in life that you deserve, Carl?
Well, probably a great deal more. I mean, if you want to take that, as you suggest, peculiar check your privilege line that we've been hearing recently, there's no way to not to say that people who live as you and I do are privileged in this society. We certainly are. To pretend that we're not and that somehow we're suffering ourselves, is a bit much.
Yeah.
What it does suggest is that those of us who are privileged in this society have a few obligations to the rest, particularly those who are not as privileged as we. And that seems to me to be worthwhile.
The trick is to keep the white working class always looking downward.
Oh, yeah.
To those below them on the social scale.
Uh-huh.
And they won't look upward about what's being done to them by Wall Street and the 1% and all of that. That's all so foreign to them. It's so utterly outside their consciousness that they just can't deal with it, and they refuse to think about it. But they love to talk about the welfare cheats and welfare queens and all of that, and the corruption in the welfare system, and waste, fraud, and abuse, and so on. And of course, there is some of that, but it doesn't have nearly the significance that they seem to think, in my opinion.
I grew up in the American South before the Civil Rights Movement, and it was clear to everyone there that the use of racism to divide the black and white working class was quite effective. I mean, white working class was told, well, yes, you haven't got unions the way they do in other parts of the country. You haven't got the sorts of supports that exist elsewhere, but at least you're not black.
Yeah.
And that was it worked. Believe me, I was there.
Yeah.
I've got another take for you on the recent elections, though. Actually, the best single account I've seen of what happened in the elections that seem to have taken place while we were off the air, right?
Yeah.
This is from Eve Smith, who writes, "The midterms were not a wave election for Republicans." That is the notion that the culmination of movements which brought the Republicans to the fore. The midterms were not a wave election for Republicans, and in fact, left policies were adopted by voters. I mean, specifically the minimum wage votes and so forth, the various ballot questions and so forth across the country that ran counter to the things that the candidates were saying. The Democrats did not lose because of technical factors like the electoral map, structural issues with their coalition, or even for the reasons put forward by emo-Dems. Emo-Dems being the emotionally Democrats, the sort of people who said, well, the reason people voted badly in this election is that they hate Obama, and therefore, the emo-Dems. Rather, the midterms were a protest against neoliberal principles and policy outcomes successfully achieved by Obama and the dominant factions of the Democratic Party. An active protest against Obama's redistribution of income to the rich, and a sullen refusal to take Obamacare as the positive good that the political class, refusing to look out the windows as they talk on their cell phones on the Acela, the train run from Washington to New York, are sure that it is. Finally, Republicans are no less despised than Democrats, and in 2016 it may well be their turn to be subject to the cycle of massacre. May and may not be true, but the fundamental point that we don't have a liberal conservative switch in this election seems to me to be absolutely right. That's where we started today. And let me finish up then by asking you a question of what does this mean for Rand Paul?
Oh, I have no idea. I just wanted to get to the idea that the turnout for the election was at a historic low, 36% of those eligible.
Quite remarkable. The lowest since 1942.
Yes,
is that what I read?
Yes.
Astonishing.
Concerning campaign spending, 94% of the bigger spenders won in the House, which again suggests something about the system, that it's very sick indeed. 82% in the Senate. So about $4 billion was spent on the election, the most ever of any election. And I think this says a lot of bad things about what's happened to our supposed democracy. But in my precinct, where I was an election judge, 434 out of the 826 registered, about 53%, which was actually more than average for the state of Illinois. But that was at Clark Lindsay Village in Urbana.
I think of two comments here. The first described to Emma Goldman, if voting could change anything, they'd make it illegal.
Right.
And the second one, the idea, I don't know who originated this, that if God had meant us to vote, he would have sent us candidates.
Right.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 46th week of 2014, a Moderate Man edition in honor of Herman Melville as interpreted by H. Bruce Franklin. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussion tonight has been Ron Szoke. Our sympathies to our colleagues who are suffering winter maladies, and our thanks to our director and producer, Jason Liggett. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview, Sunday at 4 p.m. with Neptuner David Johnson, and Progressive Voices, Monday 3 to 5 p.m. And on WRFU Radio, Living Simply, first Fridays at 8 a.m. With Neptuner Ron Szoke. There is a new column in the local online magazine Smile Politely entitled News from Neptune that represents some of the things that you may have heard here or will hear in the future here perhaps. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies and a good night to you.